Morning sun rose over the rolling plains of Dawson County, its light spilling across the rugged horizon like fire through amber glass. The land stretched for miles, fenced pastures, creaking windmills, and the scent of earth after dawn dew. To anyone else it was just countryside. But to John Beckett it was everything. His home, his sanctuary, his father's legacy. For 20 years since retiring from the Marines, John had lived on that ranch, a quiet man with strong hands and sharper instincts. His land was as disciplined as he was. Fences repaired on time, cattle fed before sunrise, every tool in its place. To him, discipline wasn't a duty, it was peace. But peace has a way of drawing envy. It started small, a letter in the mailbox. Notice of compliance, it read, from something called the Clear Valley Homeowners Association. John frowned at the words. There had never been an HOA here, not in the wide-open country where men lived by the sweat of their backs and the rules of the soil. He tossed the letter aside at first, thinking it was a mistake. His ranch was miles from any development, but a week later another one came, then a third, each one firmer than the last. They claimed his barn violated new visual harmony standards. His livestock fence was unsightly. Even his cattle troughs were non-compliant. The final letter came with a fine $2,000. That's when he started to dig. The Clear Valley HOA, it turned out, wasn't local at all. A group of investors had bought the land surrounding his property, turning old pastures into modern country estates. They registered a homeowners association that claimed jurisdiction over everything within a shared rural boundary. And John's ranch, the land his father built before most of those investors were even born, was now within that line. They were trying to fold him in, control him. At first John did what any law-abiding man would. He called, he wrote, he tried to reason. But each letter was met with cold bureaucracy, failure to comply, further action will be taken, subject to enforcement. And then one afternoon they came in person. 3 SUVs rolled up the dirt road, kicking up dust like a storm cloud. A group of well-dressed men and women stepped out, clipboards in hand, snapping pictures of his fences, his cattle, his weathered barn. The one in charge, a sharp-faced woman named Susan Leving, the HOA president, smirked as she measured his front gate with a ruler. John didn't speak. He didn't need to, his silence said enough. That evening, as the sun set behind the fields, John sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee and watched the wind move through the grass. He'd seen worse than bureaucrats with clipboards, he'd faced war, chaos, and loss. But this was different, this was personal, the land was his blood. His father's hands had built every inch of it, from the first post to the last gate. No one, no board, no outsider, no power-hungry HOA was going to take that from him. So when another notice of violation arrived the next morning, John didn't crumple it this time. He pinned it to the wall above his workbench. A reminder, a target. From that day forward, the ranch began to change. Neighbors noticed lights burning late in John's workshop, the sound of drills. Welding torches flashing through the night, strange wooden frames taking shape by the old barn. John Beckett was preparing, not with anger but precision. The same calm, methodical focus that had carried him through combat now turned toward defending his land. Because he knew something they didn't. You don't pick a fight with a man who spent his life learning how to win them. By the end of that week, the HOA's letters stopped. The next ones would come in person, and when they did, John would be ready. The wind carried a storm that night, bending the long grass and rattling the tin roof. John stood on the porch, the first drops of rain darkening his boots. In the distance, headlights appeared on the ridge road again, a slow crawl of vehicles heading his way. The HOA was coming back. But this time they weren't the only ones ready for war. The convoy of SUVs rolled down the dirt road just after dawn, their polished black paint catching the rising sun like blades of glass. Dust billowed behind them, swallowing the horizon and the quiet that had once defined Beckett Ranch. Birds scattered from the fences as tires crunched over gravel and silence turned to tension. John Beckett watched from his porch, motionless. The steam from his coffee drifted upward, the only movement in his still frame. He had been up since before the first light, finishing his morning rounds, checking his traps, tightening every last bolt and hinge. Every inch of his land was now part of a system, one designed not to harm but to teach. They wanted a war of rules. John had prepared a war of consequence. The lead SUV stopped right before the no trespassing sign, the one that wasn't just a warning, it was a statement of ownership. The HOA delegation climbed out, clipboards ready, cell phones recording. They looked around the property like vultures eyeing their next meal. At the center was Susan Leving's sharp suit, sharper smile, flanked by 2 men with cameras and another with a drone. They thought they were documenting violations. They didn't realize they were walking into a test. As they approached the first gate, a familiar creak echoed. The latch had been rigged not to break, but to release a hidden spring system John had built from old ranch parts. When they pulled, the gate swung open and dumped a wave of thick red paint across their polished shoes and trousers. A harmless mess, but a symbolic one, the color of defiance. The reaction was immediate: shouting, confusion, pictures taken for evidence. John didn't move. He simply watched, quiet and cold, as they regrouped and pressed forward. Next came the barn inspection. The HOA had claimed it was unsafe and aesthetic pollution. What they didn't know was that John had spent the last week reinforcing every beam, repainting the structure in deep rustic red, and hanging a freshly framed permit from the county inspector, one he had personally driven 40 miles to obtain. Everything was legal. Everything was perfect. When Susan tried to declare it non-compliant, One of her own associates quietly reminded her that it met every agricultural exemption clause in the state. The look on her face, the frustration of control slipping through her manicured fingers, was the first real victory of the morning. But John wasn't smiling. He wasn't done. They continued to wander the property, snapping photos of his cattle troughs, hay bales, even his windmill. Each time John followed them from a distance, boots crunching in rhythm with their heels. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence made them nervous. The sound of the countryside, the rustling trees. The low hum of distant thunder felt heavier with every step. And then they reached the back pasture. It was a wide, open stretch of land, wild grass, scattered trees, and the old wooden shed John hadn't touched in years. The perfect place for one last inspection. But what the HOA didn't realize was that John had rerouted the irrigation system through a few cleverly placed pipes. When they stepped inside the fence, a motion sensor triggered a spray of muddy water from the ground, soaking their pristine clothes and destroying their equipment in seconds. Panic erupted. The drone operator slipped. The camera fell. Laughter echoed faintly from somewhere, maybe from one of John's ranch hands watching from afar, maybe from the land itself. By the time they stormed back to their vehicles, dripping and furious, John was already standing by the front gate. He didn't say a word as they passed. Just nodded once, calm, unmoved. The HOA president rolled down her window and glared. Her expression wasn't one of defeat, it was the look of someone who had underestimated her opponent and refused to admit it. "This isn't over," her eyes said. "We'll make you bend." But John's posture said something else entirely. "I don't bend, I build." As the vehicles disappeared down the dirt road, the storm finally broke. Rain swept across the ranch, washing away footprints and red paint alike. The land felt alive again, baptized in thunder, cleansed of intrusion. That evening, John sat in his barn, oiling his tools. He knew they'd be back. Bureaucrats never gave up after humiliation, they came harder the next time. But he also knew something else: every man who walks into a trap comes out weaker the second time around. He studied the wall above his workbench. The first HOA notice still hung there, but now it was surrounded by others: maps, copies of deeds, county statutes, drone photos, and sketches of future defenses. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about principle. The next battle wouldn't be fought with paint or irrigation tricks, it would be fought with truth, law, and exposure. Because John Beckett wasn't just defending his land anymore, he was about to dismantle the machine that had tried to own it. And somewhere in the distance, through the storm, headlights appeared again. Only this time they weren't from the HOA. They were from someone else, someone unexpected, heading up the long dirt road toward the ranch. The rain had settled into a soft drizzle by the time the old pickup truck reached the ranch gates. Its headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the muddy road and the sign that marked the property's edge: Beckett Ranch, established 1972. The truck came to a slow halt, engine idling, wipers beating a steady rhythm against the windshield. John Beckett stepped out from the barn, raincoat drawn tight, his eyes narrowing as the driver's door opened. For a moment the world was quiet except for the patter of rain and the faint lowing of distant cattle. Then a figure emerged, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, wearing a sheriff's badge dulled by years of service. Sheriff Dale McKinnon. He wasn't there on official business, John could tell by the look in his eyes. It wasn't the cold stare of authority. It was the weary look of a man who'd seen too many good people pushed too far. McKinnon had known John since the Marines, two soldiers who'd gone different ways after the war but never forgot what brotherhood meant. He'd heard the rumors, of course, about the trouble at Beckett Ranch, about the HOA trying to swallow up the countryside under the guise of progress. But what he'd learned that day in town changed everything. The HOA wasn't just filing fines and citations. They were lobbying for annexation, a backdoor deal to bring the entire stretch of farmland under county supervision, effectively giving the association full control over land use, taxes, and zoning. If that passed, John wouldn't just lose his ranch, the entire valley would. As the rain poured down, McKinnon told him everything: how the investors behind the HOA were connected to a development firm, how they'd quietly bribed local officials, how they were setting up to turn the whole region into a rural luxury district. John listened in silence, hands clenched tight around his thermos. He'd expected greed, maybe arrogance, but not this level of corruption. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a full-scale invasion disguised as paperwork. And that's when the plan began to take shape. Over the next few days, the ranch turned into something more than just home. It became an operation: precise, coordinated, strategic. McKinnon used his access to old county files, uncovering records of illegal boundary adjustments. John studied property deeds that dated back to his grandfather's time, tracing every line, every clause, every forgotten right. It turned out Beckett Ranch had something no one else did: an original water rights deed from 1943 that legally granted his property independent control over the valley's underground stream. That stream fed nearly half the neighboring plots, including the newly built Clear Valley estates. If John chose to exercise that right, the HOA's entire plan would collapse overnight. Without water, no one could build. No lawns, no landscaping, no development, nothing. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same stream his father had dug by hand decades ago, the same water that once kept cattle alive during drought, could now dismantle a modern empire built on greed. But there was more to do. McKinnon introduced him to two more locals, Sam Delaney, a retired surveyor who'd been cheated out of his land by the same investors, and Marla Jenkins, a journalist who had once written for the Dawson County Herald before being forced out for exposing corruption in City Hall. Together, the four of them formed what McKinnon jokingly called the last line of the valley. They weren't armed with guns this time, but with truth, evidence, and strategy. While McKinnon gathered official reports, Sam dug through land archives, finding proof that the HOA's founding documents had been falsified. Marla started documenting every encounter, every inspection, every fine, capturing photos, recordings, and statements from other farmers who'd been harassed or fined. John, meanwhile, prepared the ranch, not for another prank but for exposure. He wired hidden cameras around the perimeter, installed a drone system for surveillance, and began compiling footage of every illegal trespass. Each clip was timestamped, logged, and stored in multiple locations. It wasn't just preparation, it was insurance. The next time the HOA came, they wouldn't just face a stubborn rancher. They'd face undeniable proof of their corruption streamed straight to the public. By the end of the week, the team had built a case strong enough to shake the entire county. But it was Marla who brought the final piece. She tracked down the main investor behind Clear Valley Development, a man named Gregory Haynes, known for running shell companies that funneled money through political donors. And as it turned out, Haynes wasn't just a developer. He was also the founding chairman of the Clear Valley HOA, everything connected. Every fine, every letter, every threat, all part of a corporate land grab hidden beneath the smiling face of community management. John didn't rage, he didn't shout. He just stood by the edge of his land that night, the moonlight reflecting off wet grass, and stared out at the distant glow of Clear Valley estates. He fought enemies with guns, explosives, and tactics. But this was the quiet kind of war that destroyed people slowly under the illusion of legality, and he was done playing defense. The plan was simple and lethal in its precision. On the upcoming HOA inspection day, John would invite them back to the ranch. Cameras would roll. McKinnon would be there in uniform, Sam with the land deeds, Marla with her recordings. And when Susan Leving and her entourage tried to enforce another violation, John would trigger the truth, not with weapons but with exposure. Every lie, every fraud, every illegal document. Broadcast lived through Marla's contacts, streamed directly to the state news channels. The HOA wouldn't even know they'd walked into their own reckoning until it was too late. That night, as lightning flashed across the plains, John sat in the workshop sharpening an old pocket knife his father had given him when he was 17. The blade glinted under the flickering bulb, a reminder of discipline, of patience, of purpose. The time for tricks and warnings was over. The storm was coming, and this time it wouldn't wash anything away, it would reveal everything. Dawn broke over the valley with a deceptive calm, the kind of silence that hangs in the air before a storm when even the wind seems to be holding its breath. The sky stretched wide and gray above the Beckett ranch, and the ground, still damp from the week's rain, shimmered with dew. But beneath the surface calm, tension hummed like a coiled wire. John Beckett was already awake. He'd been up since 4 a.m., walking the perimeter, checking the cameras, reviewing the feeds one last time. Every hidden lens, every recording device, every motion trigger had been tested twice. The old barn, the same one the HOA once called an eyesore, was now his command center, wired with monitors and backup power. Today wasn't about retaliation anymore, it was about revelation. By mid-morning, Sheriff McKinnon arrived in his cruiser, parking beside the old windmill. He stepped out, hat pulled low, his face unreadable. Behind him came Sam Delaney, the retired surveyor, carrying a weathered file box full of maps and legal documents. And finally, Marla Jenkins, camera in hand, her expression focused and fierce. Together they gathered on the porch. No one spoke much. They didn't need to, they all knew what was coming. At precisely 10 o'clock, the first SUV appeared on the ridge, then another, then a third. The convoy was larger this time, not just the usual HOA board members but several new faces, lawyers, contractors, and even a county official whose name McKinnon recognized from a corruption report years back. And there, stepping out in her signature heels, was Susan Leving. She looked different today, more guarded, her confidence calculated, the kind of smile that hides a weapon behind it. The group marched down the gravel drive, their voices low but determined, as if trying to reassert control over a situation they no longer understood. They expected another inspection, another chance to humiliate the stubborn old rancher. Instead, they were walking into their own undoing. McKinnon stood waiting at the gate, badge gleaming faintly under the morning light. When Susan approached, she hesitated, not out of respect but uncertainty. The sheriff's presence complicated things, and the camera in Marla's hand made it worse. Still, she pressed forward, handing John another folded notice, an official-looking document stamped with county seals. It declared his property non-compliant and subject to legal seizure pending unpaid fines. The words were precise, deliberate, and final. John took the paper, unfolded it, and read it in silence. Then he looked up, not at her, but at the horizon. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady and quiet, but it carried through the field like a warning carried on the wind. There was no anger in it, only resolve, and then without another word he turned and walked toward the barn. The HOA members followed, eager to record whatever reaction they thought they'd provoke. But when they stepped inside, they stopped dead in their tracks. On the far wall, multiple monitors displayed live feeds, footage from hidden cameras across the ranch. The screens showed every illegal entry, every trespass, every moment their inspectors had crossed boundaries without permission. Each clip was dated, timestamped, and annotated. Beside the monitor stood Sam's table, maps spread out, the original deeds stacked neatly atop them. At the center of it all, Marla had set up a live feed, already broadcasting to her online platform where thousands of viewers were tuning in from around the county. Susan's smile faltered. The sheriff stepped forward, his tone calm but unyielding, reading from a document of his own, a sworn affidavit confirming the HOA's unlawful extension of jurisdiction and their tampering with county zoning maps. Every word echoed inside the barn, each syllable hitting like a hammer against the fragile facade of authority. The lawyers began to whisper. The contractors looked uneasy, but John didn't look at them. He walked to the old wooden table, laid the HOA's seizure notice down, and placed his father's pocket knife on top of it, the same one he'd sharpened the night before. It wasn't a threat. It was symbolism, the old against the new, the truth against corruption. Marla spoke next, narrating calmly into her camera as she revealed Gregory Haynes's connection to Clear Valley Development, and how he, the so-called chairman, had built the entire HOA structure as a cover for land theft. She read off the shell company names, the bank accounts, the political donations, everything traced, verified, and backed by public records. The reaction was instant. Susan's eyes darted toward one of the lawyers, panic breaking through her composure. The officials behind her began murmuring, realizing that what was happening wasn't an inspection, it was an exposure. And John, ever the soldier, stood silent as the truth detonated around them. The cameras caught everything. Susan's expression cracking, the county officials stepping back, the quiet humiliation of an empire collapsing in real time. For the first time since this ordeal began, the power dynamic had shifted completely. The HOA had come to shame a man into submission. Instead, they'd been put on trial in front of the entire valley. The last nail came when Sam presented the 1943 water deed. It was undeniable, stamped and notarized, giving John full rights to the underground aquifer that supplied every nearby lot, including Clear Valley Estates. If they wanted water, they needed his consent, and after what they'd done, that consent wasn't coming. Silence filled the barn, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from defeat. One by one, the SUVs pulled away, their passengers too stunned to speak. Susan lingered last, rain now falling lightly against her shoulders as she stared at John from the gate. Her empire, her carefully constructed illusion of control, had been dismantled in a single morning. John didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The land spoke for him, the rolling fields behind him, the scent of rain-soaked soil, the quiet hum of the windmill that had seen generations pass. By afternoon, the footage had gone viral. News outlets picked it up. The Clear Valley HOA was under investigation. County officials were questioned. Lawsuits were filed. For the first time in weeks, the valley felt like it belonged to the people again. But John knew better than to celebrate too soon. The powerful never went down quietly. And if the HOA had lost control legally, they might try to take it another way. That night, long after his allies had left, John sat alone on the porch, listening to the distant growl of thunder over the hills. His dog barked once, a sharp, uneasy sound, then another. Somewhere beyond the fields, a pair of headlights flickered on, not from the road but from the woods. The battle for Beckett Ranch wasn't over. It was about to turn darker. The headlights burned like twin eyes in the darkness, steady and unblinking. They didn't belong to any of John Beckett's neighbors. He knew every vehicle within a 20-mile radius by sound alone. This one was different. He stood from his porch, coffee forgot, eyes narrowing against the night. The dog's low growl confirmed what his instincts already knew. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were watching. Hours passed, but the headlights didn't move. They stayed just beyond the treeline, faint but deliberate. By midnight, they finally disappeared, swallowed by the forest road that led toward the new development. John didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk, reviewing the day's footage frame by frame. Every detail mattered now. The HOA's empire had been exposed, but power doesn't crumble quietly, it lashes out before it dies. He'd seen it before in combat zones, in foreign deserts where small victories triggered brutal retaliation. The tactics were the same: intimidation, sabotage, and pressure until someone breaks. At dawn, John rode out to the southern pasture. What he found confirmed his suspicion. The fence was cut clean through, wire snipped, posts knocked over. A calculated strike, not vandalism. His cattle were safe, but footprints led toward the creek, boot tracks, several of them mixed with the heavy tread of equipment tires. Someone had come in the night, someone with purpose. By noon, Sheriff McKinnon arrived after John's call. He inspected the damage quietly, jaw tight, eyes scanning the horizon. The sheriff didn't need to say much. They both knew this wasn't random. No kids would have done something like this. It was too neat, too intentional. That same day, Marla reached out from town. She'd been following up on the fallout of the HOA expose, and her sources told her something chilling. Several of the Clear Valley investors had met privately the night after the live broadcast. Gregory Haynes had vanished from public view, and there were rumors that restitution was being planned. Not legal restitution, personal. As the days passed, the harassment grew bolder. A drone hovered above John's ranch one morning, buzzing like a mechanical hornet before vanishing when he aimed his rifle skyward. Mail went missing. His power flickered at odd hours. Once he found his well pump running dry, the valves deliberately tampered with. Every act was a message: we're still here. But John Beckett wasn't the kind of man who waited for trouble to knock twice. He began reinforcing his land again, but not the way he had before. The traps were gone. This time it was strategy. Cameras were doubled, every feed backed up to an off-site drive in Marla's possession. He built motion sensors along the property lines, connected to floodlights and alarms, and most importantly, he began tracking. Using the skills that had once kept him alive in the field, John studied patterns, tire marks, footprints, drone flight paths. Every clue painted a clearer picture. Whoever was targeting him wasn't working alone. It was organized, funded, and almost certainly tied to Haynes's development crew. McKinnon, bound by law, could only do so much without direct evidence, but John was free of that leash. He'd always believed in one principle above all: you don't seek revenge, you deliver consequence. So he waited. 3 nights later, the intruders returned. It was just past 2 a.m. when the first motion alarm went off near the west gate. John was already awake, sitting in the dark with his boots on, watching the live feeds from his monitors. 3 figures appeared on the infrared screen, all wearing dark clothing, carrying what looked like gas cans and tools. They moved fast, confident, heading toward the barn. He didn't move right away. Timing was everything. He waited until they crossed the second fence line, the one marked with the faintest glimmer of reflective paint, invisible without a flashlight. When they did, John triggered the alarm remotely. The floodlights erupted like lightning across the field, bathing the night in white. The intruders froze, deer caught in a storm. Sirens wailed, echoing across the valley. And then came the unmistakable sound of a shotgun racking, carried by the wind like thunder rolling over the plains. John stepped out from the barn's shadow, tall and unflinching, the figure of a man who'd already seen death and didn't fear it anymore. The intruders bolted, dropping their cans, scrambling for the tree line. But John wasn't chasing them. The cameras had done the work: every face, every movement, every license plate of the vehicle they'd arrived in. Within an hour, McKinnon was on site, lights flashing red and blue against the dark. They reviewed the footage together, faces lit by the glow of the monitors. It was clear as day. One of the men was a contractor employed by Clear Valley Development. Another was the HOA's former enforcement officer. The evidence was undeniable. By sunrise, McKinnon had issued arrest warrants and Marla's story was already in motion. Her headline hit local news feeds by noon: HOA retaliation scandal, rancher targeted after exposing land fraud. The footage spread like wildfire. Viewers were outraged. The HOA board went silent. Sponsors withdrew support. Investors cut ties. But for John, there was no satisfaction, just resolve. He knew men like Haynes didn't go down without taking others with them. They had money, connections, and pride, a dangerous mix. This was only the middle act of a longer war. That evening, as the sun bled red across the plains, John stood by the fence he'd rebuilt. The land was quiet again, almost peaceful. But he could feel something deeper, the undercurrent of unfinished business. His father's old words echoed in his mind: a man's land is his name. Protect it with truth, not rage. He'd done that, but now the time for truth had passed. Justice wasn't coming fast enough. John looked out toward the horizon where Clear Valley Estates glimmered with new construction lights, cold, artificial, and wrong against the natural sprawl of his home. The storm clouds were rolling in again, heavy and black, mirroring the weight in his chest. This fight had started as defense. Now it was about offense, taking the war to the people who had started it. The ones who hid behind money, contracts, and silence. The HOA had messed with the wrong rancher once. Now they were about to learn what that really meant. The wind that rolled over the valley that morning carried the scent of rain and something heavier, the kind of tension that presses down before a storm breaks. John Beckett stood on his porch, the brim of his hat pulled low, watching the horizon turn gray. The Clear Valley development glittered in the distance like a wound that refused to heal. 3 weeks had passed since the arrests. The sheriff had done his part. The men who'd broken into John's ranch were facing charges. The footage had gone viral and Marla's report had exposed the HOA's corruption to the state level. But something about the silence that followed didn't sit right with him. It was too quiet. That morning the sheriff called. "You might want to keep your eyes open, John," McKinnon warned. "Word is Gregory Haynes posted bail, and he ain't alone. There's talk he's calling in favors." John didn't answer right away. He looked out at the land, the wide fields, the barn, the fences he'd rebuilt for the 3rd time. He thought of all the nights spent guarding it, all the memories buried in that soil. Then he said quietly, "If they're coming, Sheriff, tell them to bring a lawyer too." By afternoon, dark SUVs appeared on the ridge road, 4 of them, no markings, windows tinted black. They stopped just short of the private property sign, engines humming like a warning growl. John stepped out, calm and deliberate, rifle slung over his shoulder but muzzle down. He wasn't here to threaten, not yet. The first man to step out was Haynes, tan suit, expensive shoes, smirk plastered on his face like a scar that wouldn't fade. "You've made quite the mess, Beckett," he said. "You think your little viral moment means anything? You embarrassed powerful people, people who don't forgive easily." John didn't flinch. "Then they should have thought of that before they tried to steal land that wasn't theirs." Haynes chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You really don't get it, do you? This was never about your few acres of dirt, it's about expansion." Progress, you're standing in the way of millions. You're one man, one stubborn, lonely man clinging to a dying patch of land. John's eyes hardened. This land has more life in it than every one of your projects combined. Haynes's face darkened. He nodded to the men behind him. They began walking forward, slow and menacing, like wolves circling prey. But before they could take another step, the low hum of engines echoed from behind John, 3 pickup trucks cresting the hill, each flying the old county rancher flag. Neighbors, friends, men and women who'd watched his fight unfold online and decided enough was enough. John didn't call them, they came on their own. The SUVs stopped moving. The men hesitated. Haynes realized what was happening. This wasn't one man anymore. It was the entire valley. McKinnon's patrol car rolled up seconds later, lights flashing red and blue through the rain. The sheriff stepped out, hand resting on his holster. "Afternoon, gentlemen, I sure hope nobody's trespassing today." Haynes's jaw clenched, his voice dropped to a hiss. "You think this changes anything, Beckett? You can't stop progress." John took a step forward, his voice calm but heavy with finality. "Progress doesn't come from taking what's not yours, it comes from building what's worth keeping. You wanted to own this valley, now you're the most hated man in it." The sheriff raised his radio. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived. Haynes's men hesitated, then began backing toward their vehicles. One by one, the engines turned, retreating down the dirt road they came from, their tires throwing up mud like smoke. Only Haynes remained standing in the rain, his perfect suit soaked, his pride shattered. "This isn't over," he spat. John looked him dead in the eye. "It is for you." Then he turned his back, the conversation finished. The sheriff moved in, cuffing Haynes under a new warrant issued just that morning. Fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The state had finally caught up. When the last cruiser disappeared down the road, John stood alone again, the rain washing over him. Marla's car pulled up a few minutes later, camera in hand, capturing the quiet aftermath. "It's done," she said softly. "They're finished. The HOA's being dissolved. The land rights are being returned." John didn't smile, he just nodded, his eyes fixed on the fields beyond. "It was never about winning," he said. "It was about keeping what's right." As the sun broke through the clouds, light spilling over the valley, it felt like the land itself was breathing again, free from the grip of greed and concrete. Marla turned off her camera and stood beside him in silence. The war was over, but not forgot. John finally turned toward her. "You ever write about this?" he said with a faint grin. "Make sure they know one thing." "What's that?" "Never mess with a man who's got nothing left to lose and land worth fighting for." The thunder rolled one last time in the distance, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was applause from the sky. The valley was quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after a long storm, not empty but healed. The air carried the scent of wet earth and blooming sage, and the fences that once marked division now stood as symbols of endurance. 2 years had passed since the battle that shook Clear Valley to its roots. The development projects had collapsed one by one, abandoned under lawsuits and state investigations. The Clear Valley HOA was now a cautionary tale across the country, a lesson in greed gone too far. John Beckett still woke up before dawn. Some habits never fade. The coffee pot still hissed the same way. The roosters still called before the sun, and the land still spoke to him in its silent, ancient language. But something was different, not in him, in everything around him. His ranch had become a beacon for the kind of people who believed in integrity, in honest work, and in living free from control. Young ranchers came to learn from him. Veterans found refuge in his guest cabin, and the small nearby towns started calling his place Freedom Ridge. It wasn't official, but the name stuck. The land that once stood on the edge of being stolen had become a sanctuary. Marla Parker returned too, not as a reporter this time, but as a friend. Her documentary The Rancher vs. the HOA had become a viral phenomenon, sparking national debate about rural independence and property rights. She won awards, but she always said the real victory wasn't in the headlines, it was in seeing justice done. Every few months she'd visit with her camera crew, capturing what had become of John's legacy. This time she wasn't here for a story, she was here to see the man who'd become a living legend in the valley. John was mending a gate when she arrived, his hands steady, his eyes as sharp as ever. The years hadn't softened him, but they'd given his silence a deeper peace. "You built something lasting here," Marla said as she watched him work. "Not just fences, something bigger." John wiped his hands and looked out at the horizon. The cattle moved slow across the field, their silhouettes painted gold by the afternoon light. "I didn't build it," he said quietly. "The land did, I just stopped people from ruining it." In the town square of Dawson County, a small plaque now hung on the courthouse wall. It read, "Dedicated to those who defend the land not for power but for honor. In memory of the stand at Freedom Ridge." People came from neighboring states to see it. Ranchers, off-grid families, and old veterans found meaning in John's story, a reminder that strength isn't measured by money or laws but by resolve. Even the sheriff, now retired, would stop by John's porch sometimes. The 2 men would sit in silence, sipping black coffee, saying little. They didn't need words. They'd seen the same storm, stood on the same ground when it mattered most. The valley thrived again. Wildflowers covered the fields that had once been scarred by construction trucks. The fences John built had become a kind of monument, proof that a man could stand alone against the tide and not just survive but prevail. At the far end of the ranch, a wooden sign faced the dirt road, "Private property but respect earns you welcome." Beneath it hung a smaller sign burned into the wood with a branding iron, "Country law, fair, firm, final." Those who passed through understood the message. This wasn't a warning. It was a code, the kind that built communities before the world forgot how to. One autumn evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, John walked to the ridge where his father used to sit. The same ridge where he had once watched the HOA cars crawl up the road like intruders in a sacred place. Now there was nothing but silence and the golden hum of peace. He knelt by the old oak tree, brushed the dirt from a weathered stone marker and rested his hand on it. "We kept it, Dad," he murmured. "They tried, but we kept it." A hawk cried overhead, circling high above the fields. The wind carried the sound of distant laughter, neighbors gathering for the evening, kids chasing each other near the barn, a dog barking at nothing. Life, real, unpolished, honest life. As the sky darkened, Marla's voice called from the porch. "You coming in, John?" He turned, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said, just making sure the land still listening. And as he walked back toward the light spilling from his cabin windows, the last of the sunset dipped below the ridge, painting the world in the colors of hard-earned freedom. Because out here in the quiet heart of the countryside, country law still meant something. And John Beckett, the man who faced an empire and didn't blink, had become more than a rancher. He had become a legend.